For 32 years, the people of Ashcroft, Montana spoke Easton Cunningham's name only in whispers if they spoke it at all. To them, he was the mechanic who had murdered a respected developer and vanished behind prison walls forever. Then, on a cold autumn morning, a prison shuttle stopped at the edge of town. A gray-haired man stepped onto the sidewalk carrying a weathered leather satchel and a single sealed envelope marked in careful handwriting. To the people of Ashcroft. Open only after my death. Sheriff Owen Mercer. The sheriff had been buried just 3 days earlier. Easton looked across the silent streets without anger. "I'm only here," he said quietly, "to keep the last promise an honest man ever made. If stories about forgotten truths, second chances, and justice that refuses to die speak to your heart, take the moment to subscribe. You may discover that sometimes the longest journey home begins with a single unopened letter." 32 years earlier, long before anyone in Ashcroft associated Easton Cunningham with prison bars and newspaper headlines, he was simply the man everyone called whenever something broke. His modest repair garage stood on the edge of Main Street, a weathered brick building with 2 service bays, faded blue doors, and a rusted sign that read, "Cunningham Diesel and Auto Repair." The paint had peeled years before, but no one cared. Easton's reputation mattered far more than appearances. If a rancher's tractor failed during harvest, Easton stayed late. If a widow's pickup refused to start in the middle of winter, he repaired it first and accepted payment only if she insisted. If a young family couldn't afford new brakes, he quietly installed them anyway, telling them to pay whenever life became easier. Many never did. He never reminded them. His wife, Margaret Cunningham, often laughed whenever she found another unpaid invoice tucked beneath the cash register. "You know," she teased one evening while sweeping the office floor, "one of these days we're going to become the richest poor family in Montana." Easton smiled without looking up from the engine block resting on his workbench. "I'd rather owe nobody than have somebody owe me." Margaret shook her head. "That's exactly why this town trusts you." Outside, 16-year-old Nathan Cunningham wiped grease from his hands after helping replace an old truck transmission. He looked almost identical to his father, same broad shoulders, same thoughtful blue eyes, same habit of concentrating so intensely that the rest of the world seemed to disappear. Their family was never wealthy, but they possessed something becoming increasingly rare inside Ashcroft. Peace. Ashcroft had once been a thriving ranching community nestled among Montana's rolling foothills. Generations had raised cattle there, harvested hay, and measured success not by bank accounts, but by hard work and neighborly trust. Those traditions began changing when large development companies discovered valuable mineral deposits beneath the surrounding land. Suddenly, ranches that had been worth little for decades became worth millions. Money arrived, then greed followed. The largest investor was Holloway Development Group, owned by Richard Holloway. Richard possessed the polished confidence that made strangers admire him within minutes. He donated generously to schools, sponsored the annual rodeo, paid for the town library renovation. He smiled often. He shook every hand. He remembered birthdays. To Ashcroft, Richard Holloway represented progress. Only a handful of people noticed how frequently elderly ranchers sold valuable land after unusually private meetings inside Richard's office. Fewer still wondered why those ranchers often left town shortly afterward. Easton never involved himself in politics. He repaired trucks belonging to everyone equally. Richard's luxury SUVs, local deputies' patrol vehicles, teachers' sedans, farmers' combines. Business was business. That neutrality earned respect. It also allowed him to hear conversations others never did. Late one rainy afternoon, a stranger pulled an aging green pickup into the garage. The driver introduced himself as Thomas Granger. Unlike Richard Holloway's expensive tailored suits, Thomas wore dusty work boots and a wrinkled flannel jacket. He looked exhausted. "Transmission keeps slipping," Thomas explained. "Think you can save it?" Easton listened carefully to the engine before nodding. It'll take a couple days. Thomas smiled. I've got nowhere else I'd rather leave it. While Easton worked, the two men talked, mostly about engines, old ranches, fishing, Montana winters. Nothing unusual. Yet Easton noticed Thomas constantly checking over his shoulder whenever someone drove past the garage. Margaret noticed, too. He's scared, she whispered after Thomas left. Easton shrugged. Maybe just stressed. But Thomas returned several more times over the following weeks. Each visit seemed stranger. He asked unusual questions. Do people around here trust Richard Holloway? What happens when old property records disappear? Has anyone ever asked you to repair equipment in abandoned places? Easton answered honestly whenever he could. I don't know. I've never heard that. Seems odd. Thomas rarely explained why he asked. One evening after the garage had closed, Thomas arrived carrying a thick folder secured with worn leather straps. I need a favor. Easton looked at the folder. What kind? If anything happens to me, Easton interrupted. That's not how you start a conversation. Thomas forced a tired smile. I mean it. He rested one hand on the folder, but never released it. There are people in this town pretending to build prosperity. They're stealing it, Easton frowned. I don't understand. You don't need to. Thomas hesitated. Not yet. He looked toward the front windows as headlights slowly passed outside. His voice dropped almost to a whisper. If I disappear. Another pause. Don't believe what people tell you. Before Easton could ask another question, Thomas tucked the folder beneath his arm and walked away into the darkness. Margaret watched from the office doorway. What was that about? Easton shook his head. I honestly have no idea. Those were the last words he ever exchanged with Thomas Granger. 3 days later, Thomas vanished. His pickup truck was discovered abandoned beside an old logging road outside town. The driver's door stood open. Fresh blood stained the steering wheel. No body was ever found. Within hours, rumors spread faster than facts. Someone claimed hearing an argument near Easton's garage. Someone else insisted Thomas had trusted Easton more than anyone. Another resident remembered seeing Easton's truck driving outside town that same evening. No one bothered confirming whether any of it was true. Fear did the work that evidence never could. Deputies arrived at Cunningham Diesel and Auto Repair before sunrise. Margaret answered the door, wearing her robe. What happened? No one answered immediately. Instead, they entered carrying a search warrant. Nathan stood frozen at the hallway entrance. Easton remained calm. There must be some mistake. Boxes were opened, cabinets emptied, drawers overturned. Then one deputy shouted, Sheriff, inside a storage cabinet, investigators found Thomas Granger's leather folder. Easton's face turned pale. I've never seen that before. But nobody listened. The folder contained copies of county survey maps, handwritten financial notes, and several documents connected to disputed land transfers. It instantly became the centerpiece of the investigation. The sheriff at that time, Harold Dixon, announced the discovery to local newspapers before forensic analysis had even begun. Headlines appeared across Montana. Local mechanic linked to missing developer. Ashcroft changed overnight. Customers stopped visiting. Neighbors crossed the street rather than greet Margaret. Nathan found classmates whispering whenever he entered school. Some teachers avoided looking him in the eye. Margaret refused to surrender. She spent every waking hour gathering information. She contacted attorneys, private investigators, state officials, everyone willing to listen. Again and again she repeated the same sentence. My husband is innocent. Few believed her. The trial began 9 months later. The prosecution presented a story that sounded convincing. Thomas uncovered financial misconduct. Easton feared exposure because he supposedly helped conceal stolen property records. The two argued. Easton murdered Thomas, then hid the body forever. The narrative contained one devastating flaw. There was almost no physical evidence. No fingerprints connecting Easton to the folder, no body, no murder weapon, no eyewitness. Only assumptions, coincidences, and frightened testimony from witnesses whose memories seemed to improve after repeated meetings with prosecutors. Easton's attorney pointed out every inconsistency: the changing timelines, the missing forensic reports, the lack of motive. But logic struggled against emotion. The entire town wanted someone responsible. Easton became the easiest answer. During closing arguments, Margaret squeezed her husband's hand. "They're going to see the truth." Easton looked into her tear-filled eyes. "I hope you're right." Hours later, the jury returned. Guilty. The courtroom erupted into relieved murmurs. Some cried. Others applauded quietly. Not because justice had been served, because uncertainty had finally ended. Judge Raymond Keller sentenced Easton Cunningham to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 30 years. Nathan screamed as deputies led his father away. "Dad!" Easton turned only once. His wrists were already handcuffed. His voice remained steady despite everything collapsing around him. "Take care of your mother." Those were the last words Nathan heard from his father for more than 3 decades. Outside the courthouse, Richard Holloway stood among dozens of townspeople. His expression was solemn, respectful, almost sympathetic. Yet as cameras focused elsewhere, a faint smile appeared for only a heartbeat before disappearing again. No one noticed. No one except an elderly janitor sweeping the courthouse steps. He watched Richard carefully, then lowered his eyes. Like nearly everyone else in Ashcroft, he chose silence. The iron gates of Blackstone State Penitentiary closed behind Easton Cunningham with a sound he would never forget. It was not loud. It was final. For the first several nights, he barely slept. Every unfamiliar noise echoed through the concrete corridors, the clanging of steel doors, distant arguments between inmates, guards shouting orders, boots scraping across polished floors. Until then, Easton had measured time by seasons. Spring meant repairing tractors before planting. Summer meant long evenings helping ranchers keep combines running. Autumn brought pickups coated with mud from cattle auctions. Winter filled his garage with frozen engines and grateful neighbors carrying hot coffee. Inside prison, seasons disappeared. Time became numbers, cell counts, meal lines, head counts, lockdowns. The first lesson came quickly. A correctional officer leaned against Easton's cell door during intake. "You've got 2 choices." Easton looked up. "You either become hard enough to survive." The officer paused. Or you become somebody else's victim." Easton said nothing. The officer mistook silence for fear. Most people did. During his first month, several inmates attempted to test him. One stole his blanket, another deliberately knocked over his dinner tray, a third challenged him in the recreation yard. Easton never fought. He never threatened anyone. Instead, he quietly picked up the spilled food, returned the blanket when he found it discarded in the hallway, and walked away from every insult. Some interpreted his behavior as weakness. Others thought he had simply given up. Neither assumption lasted very long. 3 months later, the prison laundry system broke down. Maintenance crews spent 2 days trying unsuccessfully to repair the industrial motors. Without functioning machines, hundreds of uniforms piled up. Tempers inside the prison worsened. The warden reluctantly asked whether any inmates possessed mechanical experience. Someone pointed toward Easton. "He fixed diesel engines before he got here." Easton examined the damaged equipment. Within 4 hours, every machine was running again. The maintenance supervisor stared in disbelief. "How'd you do that?" Easton wiped grease from his hands. The bearing wasn't the problem. It was installed backward. Word spread quickly. Soon, broken generators, heating systems, kitchen mixers, hydraulic doors, water pumps, and workshop equipment all found their way to Easton. He repaired everything, never complained, never demanded favors. For the first time since arriving, people stopped seeing inmate number 48176. They started seeing a mechanic again. Even hardened prisoners respected practical skill. One afternoon, a young inmate named Marcus Reed approached the workshop carrying a broken desk fan. Marcus was barely 20 years old, covered in tattoos, constantly angry. "I heard you're some kind of miracle worker." Easton smiled faintly. "I've never met one." Marcus dropped the fan onto the workbench. "My temper keeps getting me thrown into solitary." "You fix people too?" Easton chuckled softly. "No." Marcus folded his arms. "Then why does everybody come talk to you?" Easton tightened a loose wire before answering. "Because machines and people have something in common." Marcus frowned. "What's that?" "They usually break long before anyone notices." Marcus stood quietly for several seconds. That conversation marked the beginning of an unlikely friendship. Over the following years, Marcus completed vocational certifications under Easton's guidance. Another inmate learned welding. Another earned a GED. Another overcame alcoholism after countless late-night conversations through adjoining cell bars. Easton never called himself a teacher. He simply believed broken things deserved another chance, including people. Yet every evening, after lights out, he returned to the same private ritual. Hidden beneath the loose metal frame supporting his prison mattress rested 3 worn notebooks. Every page contained handwritten observations, dates, witness names, court testimony, contradictions, questions. Whenever another memory surfaced, Easton wrote it down. He reconstructed conversations from his trial, compared newspaper articles, listed missing evidence, crossed out impossible timelines. Sometimes he stared at one page for hours. The question never changed. Who placed Thomas Granger's folder inside my garage? He never found an answer, but he'd refused to stop asking. Years passed. Margaret visited faithfully whenever prison regulations allowed. The drive required nearly 5 hours each direction. She never complained. She always wore the same blue cardigan Easton had bought her during happier days. She always smiled before entering the visiting room. Only after sitting down did he notice how exhausted she looked. "I filed another appeal," she would say. "We'll keep trying." Easton squeezed her hands. "You don't have to carry all this alone." "I promised." "You also promised to take care of yourself." She smiled. "I remember." Sometimes Nathan came too, at first. The little boy who once chased butterflies behind the repair shop slowly transformed into a quiet teenager. Each visit became more difficult, not because he loved his father less, because prison made childhood impossible. One winter afternoon, Nathan sat across the metal table without speaking for nearly 10 minutes. Finally, he whispered, "Kids at school say you killed somebody." Easton's heart felt heavier than the concrete walls surrounding him. "What do you believe?" Nathan looked down. "I don't know anymore." Easton reached across the table until their fingertips barely touched. "Listen to me." "I didn't. I never will." Nathan nodded slowly, but uncertainty remained inside his eyes. It haunted Easton long after the visit ended. Then came the phone call. The prison chaplain appeared outside Easton's cell. His expression revealed everything before he spoke. "I'm sorry." Easton closed his eyes. "No. Your wife passed away yesterday morning. Complications from pneumonia." For several moments, the prison corridor became completely silent. Easton neither cried nor shouted. He simply sat on the edge of his bunk, unable to breathe. Margaret had spent nearly 14 years fighting for his freedom. She never lived to see it. The prison allowed him 1 hour alone inside the chapel. No funeral, no goodbye, no final embrace. Only memories. That evening, he opened his notebook. Instead of recording evidence, he wrote only one sentence. "I have to survive long enough to prove she was right." Not long afterward, Nathan stopped visiting altogether. Letters became infrequent, then disappeared entirely. Easton assumed his son wanted nothing more to do with him. The realization hurt almost as much as Margaret's death. Still, he refused bitterness. "If he hates me," Easton once told Marcus, "then someone taught him to. I won't blame him for believing what the whole world told him." Marcus shook his head. "You're a better man than me." "No," Easton answered quietly. "I'm just trying not to become the man prison expects." Nearly 3 decades after entering Blackstone, an unexpected visitor arrived. Not an attorney, not a journalist, not another appeals investigator, a sheriff. The receptionist announced the visitor simply as Sheriff Owen Mercer from Ashcroft County. Easton entered the interview room cautiously. The sheriff appeared younger than he expected. Early 50s, neatly pressed uniform, silver beginning to show at his temples. Most surprising of all, he carried no recorder, no deputy, no prosecutor, only a thick cardboard archive box overflowing with faded files. Mercer extended his hand. "I'm not here to question you." Easton studied him carefully before shaking it. "Then why are you here?" The sheriff opened the box. Inside lay decades-old photographs, court transcripts, evidence logs, and property maps. "I inherited every unsolved case in Ashcroft." He slid one faded photograph across the table. "Thomas Granger's abandoned pickup. I've spent 11 months reviewing yours." Easton remained silent. Mercer looked directly into his eyes. "The deeper I looked..." Another file landed on the table. "The less your conviction made sense." Easton's heartbeat quickened. For 30 years, every official who visited had come searching for another confession, never the truth. Mercer continued. "Evidence disappeared. Witness statements changed. Reports were rewritten. And someone wanted every trace buried." He hesitated before speaking again. "I believe you were convicted for a crime you never committed." Easton stared at him, not because he was shocked, because those were the first words spoken by a law enforcement officer that matched what he had known every single day for 32 years. Mercer noticed the worn notebook resting beside Easton's folded hands. "You kept records?" Easton nodded. "Every contradiction I could remember." The sheriff smiled faintly. "So did I." Neither man realized it then. But that quiet conversation inside a gray prison interview room would become the beginning of the truth that an entire town had spent 3 decades trying to bury. For nearly 2 years, Sheriff Owen Mercer became the only visitor Easton Cunningham genuinely looked forward to seeing. Unlike prosecutors who had once tried to break his resolve, or reporters searching for sensational headlines, Mercer arrived with questions instead of conclusions. Every visit began the same way. He placed another worn archive box onto the interview table. Then he said, "Let's see what history forgot this time." The prison staff gradually stopped treating the meetings as unusual. They assumed the sheriff was merely reviewing an old homicide case before retirement. Only Mercer and Easton knew something far larger was unfolding. Each conversation uncovered another crack in the foundation of the original investigation. One afternoon, Mercer unfolded a yellowing witness statement. "Remember Jacob Nolan?" Easton nodded immediately. "He owned the gas station outside town." "Shiwan?" "He testified that he saw my truck near the logging road." Mercer adjusted his glasses. "That's what the final court transcript says." He slid another document across the table. "But this is his original interview." Easton carefully read every line. His breathing slowed. The statement was completely different. Jacob had originally told investigators he wasn't certain what vehicle he had seen. He specifically wrote that it had been too dark to identify either the driver or the license plate. Someone had crossed out those sentences. Typed pages submitted during trial claimed Jacob had positively identified Easton's truck. Easton looked up. "They changed it." Mercer nodded grimly. and whoever changed it never expected anyone to compare the originals. Another afternoon brought missing laboratory reports. The next visit uncovered altered timelines. Several pieces of physical evidence had disappeared entirely from county storage sometime during the first 5 years after Easton's conviction. The pattern became impossible to ignore. This was never simple negligence. Someone had systematically erased anything capable of raising reasonable doubt. Mercer became increasingly convinced that Easton had not merely been framed, he had been selected. Someone needed an honest man with no powerful connections, someone respected enough that accusations would sound believable, someone unlikely to fight back with wealth or political influence. Easton fit perfectly. One rainy afternoon, Mercer asked a question that lingered in both men's minds long after the visit ended. "Did Thomas Granger ever tell you what he was investigating?" Easton closed his eyes. Fragments of memory surfaced. He asked strange questions. About land, property records, people disappearing after selling ranches. He kept saying somebody was stealing the future. Mercer slowly wrote every word inside a leather notebook. Then he quietly admitted something. "I found Thomas's financial records." Easton leaned forward. "They stopped 2 weeks before he disappeared." "No," Mercer corrected. "They continued." Easton's forehead tightened. "What?" "They continued for another 7 months." Silence filled the room. "Impossible." Mercer nodded. "Exactly. If Thomas died before the trial, Nero, who kept using his bank account?" Neither man answered, because neither possessed enough evidence yet. But the question refused to disappear. Months later, Mercer requested permission to inspect old county storage warehouses scheduled for demolition. Most officials approved without much interest. The buildings contained thousands of forgotten records nobody wanted. Inside one neglected basement beneath the old courthouse, Mercer discovered shelves coated in decades of dust. Broken filing cabinets leaned against cracked concrete walls. Rodents scattered as he walked deeper inside. Most boxes contained tax documents, election forms, property surveys. Then, behind a collapsed shelving unit, he noticed a locked steel cabinet. Its inventory tag had faded beyond recognition. County maintenance workers assumed it had been empty for years. Mercer forced the rusted lock open. Inside rested 12 evidence boxes, everyone labeled with Easton Cunningham's case number. His pulse quickened. Official court inventories stated those materials had been destroyed nearly 28 years earlier during flood damage. They had not. Someone had hidden them. Mercer carefully photographed everything before transferring the boxes to the sheriff's evidence vault. Late that evening, he examined each item individually. Most contained duplicate reports already known. Then he opened Box 9. Inside lay a small cassette tape. No label, no inventory record, only one handwritten date, October 14th, the day before Thomas Granger disappeared. Mercer borrowed an old cassette player from the county museum. The recording crackled heavily before voices emerged. The first belonged unmistakably to Thomas. "If anything happens to me," Static interrupted, "Richard already knows." Another burst of interference, then a second unfamiliar voice. "You've gone too far," Thomas answered calmly. "The land belongs to those families. You forged every transfer." The tape ended abruptly with shouting. Mercer replayed it 5 times. One name echoed through his thoughts. Richard. Not proof, but enough to change everything. The following week, Mercer visited Easton again. He placed the cassette player onto the interview table. "I need you to listen." When Thomas's voice filled the room, Easton froze. 30 years disappeared instantly. "I remember." Mercer watched carefully. "The second voice?" Easton closed his eyes. "I've heard him before." "But I can't place him." Mercer nodded. "Neither can I." The sheriff understood something important. Evidence alone would not survive another cover-up. Too many influential people still held power inside Ashcroft. If he officially reopened the case too early, files could disappear again. Witnesses might suddenly forget. Physical evidence could conveniently burn in another storage accident. He needed something corruption could not easily erase. Time. Then, life delivered its cruelest surprise. Mercer collapsed during a county council meeting. Doctors in Billings performed extensive tests. The diagnosis arrived 1 week later. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer. Aggressive, inoperable. Estimated survival 6 to 9 months. Mercer drove home without telling anyone. He parked outside his farmhouse and remained inside his truck until sunset. His wife, Claire Mercer, eventually walked outside carrying 2 cups of coffee. She opened the passenger door. "They told you?" He nodded. "They did." She climbed inside beside him. Neither spoke for several minutes. Finally, Mercer whispered, "I don't mind dying." Claire looked toward him. "I mind leaving something unfinished." That night, Mercer made a decision. If he could not finish exposing the truth himself, he would make certain someone else could. Over the following months, he worked in complete secrecy. Instead of compiling one obvious report, he divided every discovery into separate locations: old survey maps, financial ledgers, witness statements, audio recordings, county archives, property deeds, each hidden where only careful investigation could reconnect them. If one cache disappeared, the others would survive. He designed the trail almost like a mechanic assembling an engine. Every part depended upon the next. Only someone patient enough to understand the whole machine would reach the end. That someone was Easton. Mercer visited the prison one final time in late October. The sheriff appeared noticeably thinner. His uniform hung loosely across his shoulders. His hands trembled slightly while removing a thick, cream-colored envelope from his briefcase. Across the front, he had written carefully, "For Easton Cunningham. Open only after my death." Easton stared at the envelope. "What is it?" "My insurance policy." Mercer smiled weakly. "If I fail." "You won't," Mercer interrupted gently. "I already know." He pushed the envelope across the table. "You must promise me something." Easton nodded. "If this reaches you, don't take it straight to the newspapers. Don't hand it to politicians. Don't trust the people who suddenly claim they always believed you." Easton listened without interrupting. "The truth isn't inside this envelope." Confusion crossed Easton's face. "It isn't," Mercer shook his head. "No. The truth is still buried. This letter only tells you where to begin digging." Easton rested one hand upon the envelope. "Why me?" The sheriff's eyes softened. "Because you spent 32 years refusing to become a bitter man. Most people would have used freedom to destroy everyone. You won't. And that's exactly why you're the only person I trust with what's coming." The prison loudspeaker announced the end of visiting hours. Neither man stood immediately. Mercer extended his hand once more. "This isn't goodbye." Easton smiled sadly. "No. It's a promise." 3 weeks later, Sheriff Owen Mercer died quietly at his farmhouse with Claire and his 2 daughters beside him. The funeral drew nearly the entire town of Ashcroft. Richard Holloway delivered one of the memorial speeches. He praised Mercer's honesty, his dedication, his service. No one noticed the uneasy glance Richard cast toward the sheriff's widow when she handed a prison official one final item left among Owen's personal belongings: a weathered leather satchel. Inside it rested a sealed envelope, the one now addressed to Easton Cunningham. The promise had begun its journey. Neither the town nor the remaining conspirators realized that Owen Mercer had prepared something far more dangerous than a confession. He had prepared a map leading directly to the truth. 3 days after Sheriff Owen Mercer's funeral, the gates of Blackstone State Penitentiary opened for Easton Cunningham. The morning sky was overcast, and a cold Montana wind swept across the empty parking lot as he stepped outside carrying everything he owned. A faded denim jacket issued by the prison, a weathered leather satchel, 3 worn notebooks, and the sealed envelope Mercer had trusted him to protect. No family waited, no reporters, no celebration marked the end of 32 stolen years. Only silence. A volunteer from a prison re-entry program handed him the keys to an aging pickup truck that had been donated by a local church. "It isn't pretty," the volunteer apologized. Easton smiled as he ran his fingers across the cracked steering wheel. "If it starts every morning, it's prettier than most things I've owned lately." The old engine coughed twice before settling into a rough idle. Easton rested both hands on the wheel. For nearly a minute, he simply listened. Not to the engine, to freedom. Wind moving through pine trees. Birds. Distant traffic. Sounds no prison wall could reproduce. Then he started driving toward Ashcroft. Every mile carried another memory. The roadside diner where Margaret used to order pancakes every Sunday after church. The abandoned grain elevator Nathan loved climbing against his mother's wishes. The river where father and son once spent entire afternoons fishing without catching much of anything. Everything looked familiar. Everything looked older. Just like him. As the Ashcroft town limit sign appeared ahead, Easton slowed almost instinctively. The welcome sign had been replaced. Several new businesses lined Main Street. The old movie theater was gone. His repair shop had disappeared completely. In its place stood a sleek commercial building, occupied by Holloway Agricultural Equipment. Easton parked across the street. For a long moment he simply stared. Not with anger. With quiet acceptance. Time had continued without asking his permission. Across the sidewalk, people gradually recognized him. An elderly woman carrying groceries stopped walking. A teenager glanced between Easton and his grandfather. "Who's that?" the old man answered softly. "Someone this town should remember." Within 20 minutes, nearly everyone in Ashcroft had heard the same rumor. Easton Cunningham had come home. Richard Holloway heard it too. He was inside the conference room of Holloway Development Group reviewing contracts when his assistant hurried inside without knocking. "Richard?" He looked up. "What is it?" "He's back." Richard frowned. "Who?" The assistant hesitated. "Easton Cunningham." For the first time in decades, the confident businessman completely lost control of his expression. His face drained of color. "That's impossible." "He was released yesterday." Richard slowly stood. "What else?" "He has something." "What?" "A letter." "From Sheriff Mercer." Silence filled the room. Richard dismissed everyone immediately. When the conference room emptied, he locked the door before pulling an old brass key from his desk drawer. The key opened a hidden filing cabinet concealed behind shelves of legal books. Inside rested several sealed folders, marked only with dates. Richard removed one. Across the cover, someone had written, "Cunningham?" He stared at it for nearly the minute, then quietly whispered, "Owen. What exactly did you leave behind?" Meanwhile, Easton drove toward the county cemetery. Margaret had been buried there 18 years earlier. The cemetery caretaker recognized him instantly. Neither man spoke. The caretaker simply nodded toward the northern hillside. "She's still overlooking the valley." Easton walked slowly between rows of weathered headstones. When he finally found Margaret's grave, he stopped. A simple granite marker rested beneath a large maple tree. Margaret Ann Cunningham, beloved wife, beloved mother, gone too soon. Someone had recently placed fresh wild flowers beside the stone. Easton knelt carefully despite aching knees. His fingers brushed leaves away from her name. "I finally made it back." His voice barely rose above the whisper. "I'm sorry it took so long." No tears came. Those had been exhausted years ago. Instead, memories arrived. Margaret laughing while painting their kitchen. Margaret dancing barefoot during summer rainstorms. Margaret refusing to stop appealing his conviction despite endless rejection. I kept my promise. He touched the satchel beside him. I never admitted to something I didn't do. Wind moved gently through the maple branches. For a brief moment, Easton almost imagined she was answering. When he stood to leave, the caretaker approached, carrying a small cardboard box. I think this belongs to you. Easton looked puzzled. What is it? Margaret rented a storage locker 20 years ago. No one claimed it after she passed. We found the paperwork while cleaning old office records. Inside the box rested faded photographs, a wedding album, Nathan's elementary school drawings, several unpaid utility bills, and one unopened envelope addressed in Margaret's handwriting. To Easton. His hands trembled. The envelope bore the prison mailing stamp. Returned to sender. He slowly opened it. The paper inside had yellowed with age. My dearest Easton, if this letter reaches you then, maybe the world hasn't forgotten us yet. Nathan asks about you every night. I tell him the same thing every evening. Your father tells the truth even when truth costs everything. Don't let prison convince you that you've been abandoned. Some people still believe. I will keep fighting until my last breath. And if I don't live long enough to see you free, promise me one thing. Come home without hatred. Don't let the people who destroyed our lives decide what kind of man you become. Love always. Margaret Easton folded the letter carefully. Mercer's envelope suddenly felt heavier inside his satchel. Two people had trusted him with their final wishes. He intended to honor both. That afternoon, Easton rented a small room above the town's oldest hardware store. Its owner, 76-year-old Walter Pierce, quietly handed him the room key. You don't have to pay until next month. Easton looked surprised. You don't even know if I can. Walter smiled gently. I knew your father. He fixed my tractor more times than I deserved. You've already paid. Acts of kindness still existed. Even here. After sunset, Easton finally carried Mercer's sealed envelope to the small room. He locked the door, closed the curtains, placed the envelope upon the table. For several minutes, he simply looked at it. Then he broke the wax seal. Inside rested only 4 pages. No dramatic confession. No names of murderers. Instead, Mercer had written in his steady handwriting, Easton, if you're reading this, then I've already failed to finish what I started. The evidence exists. It always existed. People hid it because they believed no one would search long enough. Don't begin at the courthouse. That's exactly where they'll expect you to look. Go to Blackwood Ranch. Thomas Granger visited the property 6 days before he disappeared. He believed something had been hidden beneath the old livestock facilities decades earlier. Don't trust county maps printed after 1992. Use the enclosed survey instead. One person can help you. Emily Harper, county archivist. She still believes history belongs to facts rather than politics. Show her only the final page. Trust no one else until the evidence is in your hands. Remember this. The truth isn't buried in one place. It's scattered. Someone designed it that way long before I arrived. Find the first piece. The rest will begin finding you. Owen Mercer. Folded inside the final page lay an old hand-drawn survey map. Unlike modern county records, this map displayed buildings no longer officially existed. One location had been circled several times in red ink, an abandoned windmill. Beside it, Mercer had written only 3 words, "Start here." Easton studied the map until nearly midnight. He recognized the property immediately. Blackwood Ranch, nearly 15 miles west of town. Abandoned for almost 30 years. Most residents believed it had collapsed after a series of harsh winters. No one had mentioned it since. The next morning, Easton walked to the county historical archives. The building occupied what had once been Ashcroft's first elementary school. Inside, shelves overflowed with old newspapers, census records, handwritten journals, and faded photographs documenting nearly 2 centuries of local history. Behind the reception desk sat a woman in her late 30s, wearing wire-rimmed glasses and a dark green cardigan. She looked up from a stack of archival maps. "Can I help you?" Easton hesitated only briefly. "My name is Easton Cunningham." Recognition immediately crossed her face. Not fear, curiosity. "I know who you are." He slowly removed the final page of Mercer's letter. Without speaking, he handed it to her. Emily Harper read the page once, then again. Her eyes widened. She looked directly at Easton. "When Sheriff Mercer visited 6 months ago, he told me that if the man carrying this page ever walked through that door, I was to believe every word he said." She carefully folded the letter closed, then walked toward a locked cabinet at the back of the archives. Removing an old brass key from around her neck, she unlocked the cabinet and carried out a large leather map case covered in decades of dust. She placed it gently on the table. "I think," she said quietly, "this is where we begin." Neither of them noticed the dark pickup truck parked across the street. Inside, one of Richard Holloway's employees lowered a camera after photographing everything through a telephoto lens. Minutes later, a text message reached Richard's phone. He's not alone anymore. Richard stared at the photograph, then at the folder marked Cunningham, still lying open on his desk. For the first time in more than 30 years, he realized the past had begun moving toward him. And this time, it wasn't coming quietly. The leather map case smelled of dust, old paper, and cedar. Emily Harper laid it carefully across the long oak table inside the county archives, brushing away decades of dirt before loosening the cracked leather straps. Inside rested survey maps unlike any Easton had ever seen. Some had been hand-drawn in ink, others were blueprints faded almost white with age. Every page carried dates reaching back more than 70 years. Emily glanced toward the front windows before quietly locking the archive's entrance. "We shouldn't be interrupted." Easton looked up. "You think someone might be watching?" Emily hesitated. "I don't know." But Sheriff Mercer always insisted that if this investigation ever started again, it would attract attention almost immediately. She spread 3 maps across the table. At first, they appeared nearly identical. Same ranch boundaries, same streams, same barns. Then she pointed toward the oldest survey. "Look here." Easton leaned closer. An entire network of narrow maintenance tunnels stretched beneath Blackwood Ranch. Small underground passages connected the livestock barn, grain storage building, water pump station, and an old windmill standing nearly 300 yards from the main house. Easton frowned. "I've never seen this." "You weren't supposed to." Emily opened a newer county survey printed 15 years later. The tunnels had disappeared completely. So had 2 storage buildings. Officially, they had never existed. Someone had rewritten the property itself. "Can records legally be changed like this?" Easton asked. Emily shook her head. "Only if the structures were demolished." "Were they?" "I checked aerial photographs. They were still standing for another 20 years. Silence settled between them. Mercer had been right. The lies reached far beyond the courtroom. Someone had altered history. Emily retrieved another folder. "This came from Owen." Inside rested copies of handwritten notes made during the sheriff's final months. One sentence had been underlined 3 separate times. If the original survey is accurate, the windmill foundation was never built for water. It was built to hide something. Easton folded the paper slowly. "When do we leave?" Emily smiled faintly. "I was hoping you'd ask." An hour later, they loaded the old pickup with supplies: flashlights, rope, a portable generator, shovels, metal detectors borrowed from the county museum, food, water, first aid kits. Emily insisted on bringing a digital scanner to preserve any documents they discovered before moving them. If these records survived 30 years, she said, I'm not risking losing them now. The drive toward Blackwood Ranch took nearly 45 minutes. The farther west they traveled, the fewer signs of civilization remained. Telephone poles disappeared. The paved highway became gravel. Mountains rose higher around them. Eventually, the road narrowed into little more than twin dirt tracks cutting through dense pine forests. Easton slowed as an old, rusted gate appeared ahead. Blackwood Ranch. The faded wooden sign leaned sideways beneath climbing vines. One chain hung broken. The other had rusted almost completely through. Emily looked towards the abandoned property. No one's lived here since I was a child. Easton gently pushed the gate open. Its hinges groaned loudly. Beyond it stretched nearly 2,000 acres of forgotten land. Tall grass swallowed old fence lines. Collapsed corrals lay scattered across rolling hills. Weathered barns leaned dangerously after decades without maintenance. Everything looked abandoned. Everything except the tire tracks. Easton crouched near the entrance road. Fresh impressions crossed the muddy ground. No more than 2 days old. Emily knelt beside him. Someone's been here. They're using all-terrain tires. Easton studied the pattern. Heavy vehicle. Probably a truck. They exchanged uneasy glances. Neither spoke the obvious thought aloud. Someone else had already started looking. The ranch house stood near the center of the property. Broken windows reflected gray afternoon skies. The front porch sagged beneath years of snow damage. Inside furniture remained exactly where the last owners had abandoned it. Dust coated every surface. Family photographs still hung crookedly on peeling walls. A grandfather clock stood permanently frozen at 7:42. Emily quietly photographed each room. Easton searched more practically. Nothing seemed disturbed. No recent footprints. No signs anyone had entered the house for years. Then they walked toward the windmill. Its weathered blades no longer turned. Half the tower leaned slightly eastward. The concrete foundation spread nearly 20 feet across. Easton circled it twice. It feels wrong. Emily looked puzzled. What does... the size? She examined the base carefully. He was right. Most ranch windmills rested upon simple concrete pads. This foundation resembled a bunker, nearly 4 feet thick, far larger than necessary. Emily unfolded the original survey. According to the blueprint, an access hatch should have existed beneath the western side. They searched for almost an hour. Nothing. Only cracked concrete, dead weeds, rusted bolts. Eventually, Easton noticed something unusual. The surrounding grass grew differently along one narrow section, shorter, less dense, almost as though heat had once escaped from below. He tapped the concrete with a heavy wrench. Most sections produced a dull, solid sound. One section echoed slightly, hollow. Emily's heartbeat quickened. You found it. Using crowbars, they pried away decades of packed soil covering the edge of the slab. Slowly, a rusted steel ring emerged. Then another. An old maintenance hatch, almost perfectly hidden beneath dirt and vegetation. The hinges resisted stubbornly. Together they strained until the metal finally gave way with a deafening groan. A rush of cold, stale air escaped from below. Easton switched on his flashlight. Concrete stairs disappeared into darkness. Emily swallowed nervously. You first, Easton smiled. Age before youth. Despite the joke, both descended cautiously. The underground chamber surprised them. Instead of a crude tunnel, they discovered a carefully constructed maintenance corridor lined with reinforced concrete. Electrical conduit still ran along the ceiling. Old ventilation pipes remained intact. Someone had invested enormous money building it. The tunnel extended nearly 100 yards before splitting into 2 directions. Emily compared the intersection with the survey. Left goes toward the livestock barn. Right reaches the pump station. What now? Easton pointed toward the right passage. The sheriff circled the windmill. "I think we're close." 20 minutes later, the tunnel ended at a heavy steel door. Unlike everything else underground, this door looked relatively modern. Someone had replaced it decades after the tunnel was built. A thick combination lock secured the entrance. Emily sighed. "So much for getting lucky." Easton examined the mechanism. "Maybe." He ran his fingers across the metal. Scratches surrounded the dial. Someone had opened it many times. Then suddenly he noticed 4 numbers lightly etched beneath the handle. 10/214, October 14th, the date written on the cassette tape Mercer discovered. Thomas Granger's final recording. Easton slowly entered the combination. 10, 14, nothing. He tried another sequence. 10, 1. The lock clicked. Emily stared in disbelief. "You've got to be kidding." Easton carefully pulled the door open. Inside waited a small, reinforced storage room. Empty shelves lined 3 walls. For one horrifying moment, both believed they had arrived too late. Then Emily's flashlight stopped. There, resting beneath the lowest shelf, stood a weatherproof military-style steel container, nearly 3 feet long, olive green, covered in dust. Unlike the empty shelves, it remained sealed. A faded shipping label had almost disappeared beneath corrosion. Thomas Granger. Easton knelt slowly. His hands trembled. 32 years. Everything might finally begin here. Emily photographed the container before touching it. The padlock had rusted badly. Easton cut it using heavy bolt cutters brought from the truck. The lid creaked open. Inside lay carefully wrapped bundles protected by waterproof canvas. Neither spoke. They removed each item one by one. Original county land deeds, leather-bound financial ledgers, cassette tapes, dozens of undeveloped film rolls, survey stakes marked with handwritten coordinates, small notebooks, a thick stack of notarized affidavits, and finally, a large leather journal. Its first page carried Thomas Granger's unmistakable handwriting. If you're reading this, then either I succeeded, or someone finally refused to stop searching. Emily's eyes filled with tears. 30 years. Easton gently turned another page. Thomas described discovering forged mineral rights contracts, bribed county commissioners, fake land appraisals, entire ranches stolen through fraudulent transfers disguised as voluntary sales. Every transaction traced back toward one organization. Holloway Development Group. Richard Holloway's signature appeared repeatedly throughout the copied documents. But one sentence near the middle of the journal stopped Easton cold. "If anything happens to me, Richard isn't the beginning. He's only the man who inherited the conspiracy. The first architect still walks free." Easton looked toward Emily. "What does that mean?" She slowly shook her head. "It means Richard wasn't the original mastermind." "So who was—" Neither knew. Not yet. Before they could continue reading, a faint metallic sound echoed through the tunnel outside. Footsteps. Several pairs. Not hurried. Careful. Deliberate. Easton immediately closed the journal. Emily switched off her flashlight. Darkness swallowed the room. Both held their breath. The footsteps stopped just beyond the steel door. Someone tested the handle. Very slowly. Then a man's voice whispered from the darkness outside. "They've already found it." Another voice answered. "Call Mr. Holloway." The hunt had become something far more dangerous. They were no longer searching alone. Someone else had just arrived, determined to make sure the truth never left Blackwood Ranch alive. The whispered words outside the steel door seemed to freeze the air itself. "They've already found it. Call Mr. Holloway." Easton Cunningham instinctively lowered the heavy journal back into the steel container, while Emily Harper covered the beam of her flashlight with her jacket. The underground chamber fell into complete darkness. Neither of them moved. The footsteps remained outside. Slow, measured, professional. These were not curious hikers exploring abandoned property. These were people accustomed to entering places they did not want others to find. A flashlight beam slipped through the narrow gap beneath the steel door, sweeping slowly across the concrete floor. Emily barely breathed. Easton quietly counted the voices. At least 3, perhaps 4. One man tested the handle again. "It's unlocked." Another answered immediately. "No." "Mr. Holloway said nobody touches anything until he gets here." "What if they're still inside?" Silence followed. Then another voice. "If they are, they're trapped." Easton glanced toward the back wall. No second exit, no hidden tunnel, only shelves, concrete, and the single steel door separating them from the men outside. Emily leaned close enough for him to hear only a whisper. "What do we do?" Easton closed his eyes for one brief moment. 32 years in prison had taught him something many free people never learned. Panic wastes time. Thinking saves lives. His flashlight swept across the ceiling. Ventilation ducts, electrical conduit, drainage pipes. Then he noticed something unusual near the upper corner of the room. An old maintenance grate. Small. Almost hidden behind decades of dust. According to the faded blueprint, Mercer had left the storage room originally connected to the water system before later renovations sealed most access passages. Easton silently pointed upward. Emily followed his gaze. Her eyes widened. The grate was barely large enough for one person to crawl through. Easton inspected the rusted screws, completely corroded. He slowly inserted the flat end of a pry bar beneath one corner. Every movement had to remain silent. Outside, someone lit a cigarette. The smell drifted beneath the doorway. Another man laughed quietly. "They've got nowhere to go." Easton gently twisted the pry bar. One screw snapped, then another. Emily steadied the grate before it could fall. Within seconds, a narrow opening appeared. Easton whispered, "You first." Emily shook her head immediately. "No." "You?" Easton smiled faintly despite the danger. "You know these documents. I know engines. If one of us gets separated, history has to survive." Emily understood. Without another word, she climbed onto the lower shelf, pulling herself into the ventilation shaft. Easton carefully handed her the leather journal, then the cassette tapes, the land deeds, finally the notebooks. He kept only one thing, Sheriff Mercer's letter. Once Emily disappeared deeper into the narrow passage, Easton followed. Moments later, the steel door below burst open. Flashlight beams flooded the storage room. Voices echoed angrily. "They were here! Search everything!" They couldn't have gone far. A boot struck the empty steel container. Someone cursed loudly. They took the files. The ventilation shaft twisted sharply before climbing upward. Dust filled the air. The metal scraped loudly beneath Easton's knees. Behind them came shouting. "They're in the vent! Hurry!" One flashlight beam suddenly shone through the grate behind them. A gunshot exploded inside the tunnel. The bullet ricocheted harmlessly off concrete. Emily flinched. Easton's voice remained calm. "Keep moving." The shaft climbed another 30 feet before ending beneath a rusted water pump house nearly 80 yards from the windmill. Emily pushed upward. The hatch refused to move. Again, nothing. Easton reached past her. He shoved harder. Rotten wooden boards finally splintered apart. Fresh mountain air rushed inside. Both climbed onto the overgrown hillside just as voices erupted beneath them. "They're outside!" Easton grabbed the map case. "Run!" Neither wasted another second. They sprinted across waist-high grass toward the dense pine forest surrounding the ranch. Behind them, engines roared to life. Pickup trucks, at least two. Emily looked over her shoulder. They're coming. Easton spotted an old logging trail disappearing between towering evergreens. This way. Branches slapped against their faces as they pushed deeper into the woods. Years of prison had weakened Easton's body, but determination carried him farther than strength alone ever could. The forest gradually became steeper. Loose rocks covered the narrow path. Emily nearly slipped twice. Finally, they reached an abandoned fire lookout overlooking the valley. Below them, they could clearly see Blackwood Ranch. 2 black pickups circled the windmill. Another blocked the entrance gate. Several men searched the surrounding fields. One vehicle arrived moments later, a silver luxury SUV. Richard Holloway stepped out. Even from nearly half a mile away, Easton recognized him immediately. Richard removed his sunglasses, while another man handed him an empty steel container recovered from underground. He examined it for several seconds before throwing it violently against the truck. His anger was unmistakable. Emily quietly raised her camera's telephoto lens. Click, click, click. She photographed every vehicle, every face, every license plate, every movement. They'll deny being here. They won't deny photographs. Easton nodded approvingly. For the first time since leaving prison, they possessed evidence, real evidence. Not rumors, not assumptions. Richard eventually gathered everyone around him. Although the distance prevented hearing individual words, his body language revealed enough. He pointed repeatedly toward the surrounding mountains. Search parties divided into groups. They're hunting us. Emily lowered the camera. What now? Easton thought carefully. We don't go back to town. Why? Because Richard expects us there. Instead, they followed forgotten hiking trails deeper into the mountains until sunset. Several miles later, they reached an abandoned Forest Service ranger cabin. Its windows remained intact. The roof leaked slightly, but it offered shelter. Emily spread the recovered documents across an old wooden table. Both stared silently. The sheer volume overwhelmed them. Dozens of property deeds, hundreds of financial transactions, audio recordings, personal journals, nearly 30 years of hidden history. Easton picked up Thomas Granger's journal again. This time he began reading carefully from the beginning. Thomas described months spent investigating unexplained land transfers. At first he believed isolated fraud had occurred. Then patterns emerged. Entire ranches purchased far below market value. Widows pressured into selling. Families suddenly facing mysterious tax liens. County records altered after every transaction. The farther Thomas investigated, the more frequently one surname appeared. Holloway. But Richard Holloway had not started the operation. His father, Charles Holloway, had. Easton looked toward Emily. So Richard inherited more than a company. Emily nodded slowly. He inherited the entire criminal network. Thomas continued writing about secret meetings, hidden financial accounts, shell corporations, bribed surveyors, corrupt judges. Then another name appeared repeatedly, Sheriff Harold Dixon, the very sheriff who had arrested Easton 32 years earlier. Emily whispered, he wasn't just incompetent. He was involved. Another notebook confirmed it. Thomas had secretly recorded dozens of meetings proving Sheriff Dixon accepted payments in exchange for manipulating investigations. Easton closed the journal. Everything suddenly made sense. Why witnesses changed testimony. Why evidence disappeared. Why no serious investigation followed. The sheriff himself had controlled the investigation from the beginning. Emily opened another sealed envelope discovered inside the steel container. Her expression changed immediately. What is it? She slowly handed him several photographs. Easton's hands trembled. The photographs showed Thomas Granger alive, standing beside Sheriff Owen Mercer. The dates shocked both of them. only 8 months before Thomas officially disappeared. Emily frowned. That's impossible. Mercer wasn't sheriff yet. Exactly. He hadn't been. At the time, he served as a deputy under Sheriff Harold Dixon. The final photograph showed Mercer secretly copying files inside the evidence room late at night. On the back, Thomas had written one sentence. Deputy Mercer finally believes me. If I disappear, he'll keep searching. Easton leaned back in silence. Mercer had not stumbled upon the truth decades later. He had been chasing it almost from the beginning, for over 30 years, without ever giving up. Outside, thunder rolled across the mountains. Rain began falling against the cabin roof. Emily carefully organized the evidence into separate piles. We have enough to expose Richard. Easton looked thoughtfully toward the storm outside. No. Emily looked surprised. What do you mean? We have enough to expose what Richard inherited. But Thomas wrote something else. She understood immediately. Richard wasn't the beginning. Someone older had built the system. Someone whose name still hadn't appeared. Someone powerful enough to corrupt a sheriff, steal ranches, frame an innocent mechanic, and hide the truth for over 3 decades. Easton quietly reopened the journal to its final unwritten pages. Between them rested one folded sheet that neither had noticed before. No handwriting, only a faded photograph. It showed 5 men standing proudly in front of Ashcroft's original courthouse in 1981. Charles Holloway, Sheriff Harold Dixon, Thomas Granger, a county commissioner, and one unidentified man whose face had been deliberately scratched away with a knife. On the back, someone had written only 6 chilling words. He started everything. Find his real name. The storm outside intensified. Lightning illuminated the dark forest surrounding the cabin. Somewhere beyond those trees, Richard Holloway's men were still searching. But Easton now understood something even more frightening. Richard Holloway wasn't protecting his father's crimes alone. He was protecting the identity of the one man whose name had been erased from history itself. And until that name was found, the truth remained incomplete. Rain continued pounding the roof of the abandoned ranger cabin long after midnight. Neither Easton Cunningham nor Emily Harper slept. The evidence spread across the old wooden table had changed everything. For 32 years, Easton believed proving his innocence would be enough. Now he understood the truth reached much farther. His wrongful conviction had been only one piece of a machine that had quietly stolen land, destroyed families, manipulated courts, and buried anyone who threatened to expose it. Emily carefully arranged the recovered documents into separate folders. If something happens to us, she said quietly, these can't all stay together. Easton looked up. You think they'll come here? Emily gave a tired smile. If Richard Holloway realized we escaped with Thomas Granger's evidence, he won't stop looking. Easton nodded. Then we make it impossible for one mistake to destroy everything. By sunrise, they had divided the evidence into 4 separate packages. The original land deeds, Thomas Granger's journals, the financial ledgers, the cassette recordings. Each bundle would travel separately if necessary. Mercer had designed the investigation that way. Now Easton understood why. 1 fire, 1 robbery, 1 dishonest official. That was all it would take to erase decades of truth, unless the truth lived in several places. Nearly 15 miles away, Richard Holloway had not left his office since the previous afternoon. Coffee cups covered his conference table. Maps of Blackwood Ranch lay scattered across the room. His security director, Frank Dobbs, stood near the window. We searched until 3 in the morning. No sign of them. Richard remained silent. Frank continued. We found the ventilation shaft. They planned their escape. Richard slowly turned. No. They improvised. Frank frowned. What difference does it make? It tells me Easton still thinks like a mechanic. Richard pointed toward the ranch blueprint. He solves problems. He doesn't panic. He'll protect evidence before protecting himself. Frank crossed his arms. So, what's next? Richard answered without hesitation. We stop chasing him. Frank looked confused. What, if I were Easton? I'd expect us to keep searching. So we do the opposite. Richard walked toward the hidden filing cabinet. He removed another folder. This one carried a different name. Nathan Cunningham. He has a son. Frank's expression hardened. We know where he lives. Richard nodded slowly. Oregon. If Easton has any weakness left, it's family. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away in Portland, Oregon, Nathan Cunningham sat inside the newsroom of the Northwest Sentinel, reviewing an environmental corruption story. At 44, Nathan had earned a reputation for exposing corporate fraud across the Pacific Northwest. His coworkers admired his patience. His editor admired his relentless attention to detail. Few knew where that determination came from. Nathan rarely discussed his childhood. He never mentioned prison, or Montana, or his father. The receptionist interrupted his morning meeting. There's a package for you. Nathan frowned. I wasn't expecting anything. The box contained no return address. Inside rested only one newspaper, Ashcroft County Gazette. The front page headline read, Wrongfully convicted man returns home after 32 years. Beneath the headline appeared a photograph. An older man stepping from a prison transport. Gray hair, weathered face, a worn leather satchel over one shoulder. Nathan stared at the image. His editor noticed. You know him? Nathan answered almost automatically. He's my father. Silence filled the newsroom. Nobody spoke. Nathan folded the newspaper carefully. For more than 3 decades, he had trained himself not to think about Easton Cunningham. As a teenager, he stopped writing letters, stopped asking questions, stopped defending a man everyone insisted was a murderer. Eventually, believing became easier than doubting. His mother had died. His father remained imprisoned. The story seemed finished. Now, it had somehow begun again. Back in Montana, Easton and Emily drove toward the neighboring county instead of returning directly to Ashcroft. Emily had an old friend named Rebecca Lawson, a federal land records specialist working from a regional archive in Helena. If anyone can verify these deeds, Emily explained, it's Rebecca. The drive took nearly 4 hours. Neither noticed the gray SUV following them at a careful distance. Frank Dobbs smiled behind the wheel. He no longer needed to search. He simply needed to wait. Rebecca Lawson examined the first property deed beneath a bright archival lamp. Within minutes, her expression changed. Where did you get these? Emily exchanged a quick glance with Easton. Can you verify them? Rebecca nodded slowly. They're authentic. She opened a digital county database, then compared it with the originals. For nearly 20 minutes, she said nothing. Finally, she leaned back. This is impossible. Easton quietly asked, What is? Rebecca pointed toward 2 documents. The original deed transferred ownership from the Wilson family to the Granger Conservation Trust. She clicked another record. But 6 months later, someone replaced it. The official database now listed Holloway Development Group as the legal owner. No court order. No probate ruling. No legal transfer. It simply changed. Rebecca looked genuinely disturbed. I've never seen fraud this sophisticated. She opened another deed, then another. The pattern repeated. Again and again. 27 separate ranches, all altered, all benefiting companies connected to the Holloway family. Rebecca slowly removed her glasses. This isn't local corruption. This required state cooperation. Easton felt the room grow colder. Meaning, Rebecca answered carefully. Someone above county government helped protect this. The conspiracy had just become much larger. That evening, Rebecca locked every verified document inside a secure archival vault. "I'll make certified copies tomorrow. No one can access these except me." Easton thanked her sincerely. For the first time in decades, strangers believed him before asking him to prove himself. It felt unfamiliar, almost uncomfortable. Emily noticed. "You still expect people to doubt you." Easton smiled sadly. 32 years is a long habit. Across town, Frank Dobbs watched the archive building through binoculars. He spoke quietly into his phone. "They stored something." Richard's voice answered immediately. "Do not break in." Frank looked surprised. "You want me to wait?" Richard's reply came without emotion. "Breaking into a federal archive brings investigators. I want the evidence." "Not headlines." Frank nodded. "Understood." Richard ended the call. Then he picked up another phone, this one much older. He dialed a number from memory. The man who answered spoke only 3 words. "I was expecting you." Richard lowered his voice. "They found Thomas's files." A long silence followed. Then the unseen man replied, "I warned your father 30 years ago." Richard's expression tightened. "What do we do?" The answer chilled him. "You don't stop Easton Cunningham. You stop the people willing to believe him." The line went dead. Richard stared at the receiver. Even after all these years, someone still gave him orders. The following morning, Easton walked alone through Helena's quiet downtown before meeting Emily for breakfast. For the first time since leaving prison, he entered a small bookstore. He wandered slowly through the aisles, not looking for anything specific, simply enjoying the freedom to stand wherever he wished. An elderly woman working the register watched him for several minutes. Finally, she approached. "Excuse me?" Easton turned. "I recognized you from the newspaper." His shoulders instinctively tensed. He had heard those words before. Usually they ended badly. Instead, the woman extended an old hardcover Bible. "My brother was wrongly convicted. He died before anyone admitted the mistake." She smiled gently. "I just wanted you to know. I'm glad you lived long enough to come home." Easton accepted the gift with quiet gratitude. After she walked away, he remained standing motionless. 32 years. He had imagined freedom would feel triumphant. Instead, it felt fragile, like something that could disappear if he wasn't careful. That afternoon, as Easton and Emily prepared to leave Helena, a television mounted inside the restaurant. The restaurant suddenly interrupted regular programming. Breaking news. A reporter stood outside the Oregon office of the Northwest Sentinel. "The son of recently released prisoner Easton Cunningham has reportedly left Portland this morning after receiving information connected to his father's case." Emily looked toward Easton. "Your son?" Easton's eyes never left the television. Nathan was boarding a flight, coming home. Not because he believed, but because questions he had buried since childhood had finally become impossible to ignore. Hundreds of miles away, Nathan looked out the airplane window as the aircraft climbed above the clouds. In his briefcase rested the newspaper showing his father's face. Beside it lay one faded photograph he had carried since childhood. A smiling mechanic lifting a young boy onto the hood of an old pickup truck. Nathan whispered almost to himself, "I don't know who you really are anymore. But I'm finally coming to find out." Neither father nor son knew that another journey had already begun. Richard Holloway had activated every remaining ally still loyal to the old conspiracy. The hunt was no longer about stolen land, or forged documents, or hidden fortunes. It had become a race to determine whether the truth could reach a son, before the last surviving guardians of a 32-year lie reached him first. By the time Nathan Cunningham landed in Billings, Montana, the story had spread far beyond Ashcroft. National news outlets called it one of the most remarkable wrongful conviction cases in decades. Television commentators debated whether the justice system had failed. Legal experts questioned how so much evidence could have disappeared. But none of them knew the full story. Only Easton, Emily, and a handful of trusted people understood that proving Easton's innocence was no longer the ultimate goal. The greater truth still remained hidden. Nathan rented a car and drove west toward Ashcroft. The familiar mountains stirred memories he had spent years trying to forget. The old bridge where his father taught him how to fish. The church where his parents renewed their wedding vows. The repair shop where he had learned to hold a wrench before he was tall enough to reach the workbench. Every mile made him wonder whether his childhood had been built upon a lie. Not his father's, everyone else's. Easton and Emily returned to Ashcroft later that same afternoon. Instead of hiding, they went directly to Sheriff Owen Mercer's widow. Claire Mercer welcomed them into the farmhouse with quiet warmth. The house still carried Owen's presence. His hat rested on the hallway table. Reading glasses remained beside his favorite chair. A half-finished woodworking project sat untouched in the garage. Grief lingered in every room. Claire poured coffee before speaking. Owen knew this day would come. She disappeared upstairs and returned carrying another weathered wooden box. I wasn't supposed to open this. He told me to give it to you only if you found Thomas's evidence. Easton slowly lifted the lid. Inside rested Owen's personal investigation journals. Unlike the official reports, these notebooks contained his private observations, suspicions, names, questions, people he never fully trusted. Emily opened the first notebook. Every page was filled with meticulous handwriting. Owen had documented nearly every interview he conducted over the last 8 years. He had also written something unexpected. Not everyone stayed silent because they were evil. Many stayed silent because they were afraid. If Ashcroft is ever going to heal, the innocent must be separated from the guilty. Easton smiled faintly. That sounds like him. Claire nodded. He never wanted revenge. He wanted honesty. As Emily continued reading, one particular page caught her attention. Owen interviewed someone named Walter Pierce. Easton looked surprised. The owner of the hardware store. Claire nodded. Owen visited him 3 times. He believed Walter knew something. Walter Pierce had lived in Ashcroft for nearly 80 years. His small hardware store had survived floods, recessions, wildfires, and changing generations. When Easton entered that evening, Walter was closing the front door. I figured you'd be coming. Easton smiled. Did you? Walter quietly locked the door, then turned the sign to closed. I've been waiting 32 years. Emily and Easton exchanged a glance. Walter slowly walked toward the back office. Inside hung dozens of old photographs documenting Ashcroft's history. One image immediately caught Easton's attention. The same courthouse photograph Thomas Granger had hidden inside the journal, except this version had not been damaged. The 5th man's face remained untouched. Easton's breathing slowed. An older gentleman wearing an expensive gray suit stood beside Charles Holloway and Sheriff Harold Dixon. Walter removed the photograph from the wall. I always wondered when someone would finally ask about him. Easton looked carefully. I've never seen him before. Walter nodded. Most people haven't. His name was Benjamin Ashcroft. Emily looked confused. As in, the town. Walter nodded. His grandfather founded Ashcroft. He became the richest landowner in the county. He also taught Charles Holloway everything he knew. Easton studied the face carefully. So he started it. Walter sighed heavily. No. He perfected it. Walter sat slowly in his old wooden chair. I was 25. I worked at the courthouse. I saw deeds disappear. I watched signatures change. I knew ranchers were losing everything. So why didn't you say anything? Emily asked gently. Walter stared silently at the floor. Because Benjamin Ashcroft owned half the county. Charles Holloway owned the other half. Harold Dixon controlled the law. I had a wife, a baby daughter. They made sure I understood what would happen if I talked. His voice broke, so I stayed quiet. Easton said nothing. Walter looked toward him. I've wanted to apologize every day since they arrested you. Easton slowly pulled out a chair and sat opposite him. You were afraid. Walter nodded, tears forming. I was a coward. No, Easton answered softly. They wanted everyone to believe they were powerless. Walter covered his face. I could have helped. Maybe, Easton replied. But you can still help now. Walter looked up. What do you need? Easton placed Owen Mercer's notebook onto the table. The truth. Everything. Walter took a long breath. Then he began talking. For nearly 3 hours, he described secret meetings inside the courthouse basement, cash delivered in plain envelopes, landowners threatened with false tax charges, judges pressured into approving fraudulent transfers, surveyors bribed to redraw boundaries, even Thomas Granger. Walter remembered seeing Thomas arguing with Benjamin Ashcroft just days before disappearing. What were they arguing about? Emily asked. Walter closed his eyes. I only heard one sentence. What was it? Walter looked directly at Easton. Thomas said, I already copied every document before you burned the originals. The room became silent. Emily immediately opened Thomas's journal. She searched quickly, then stopped. There. One sentence buried deep inside an earlier chapter. Original copies secured elsewhere. If they destroy these, another set survives. Easton looked toward Emily. There are more. She nodded. Another archive. But where? Walter suddenly stood. I know. Both turned toward him. When Benjamin Ashcroft built the new courthouse, he ordered the old county bank demolished. It wasn't demolished. They built the courthouse over it. Emily's eyes widened. The underground vault. Walter nodded. It still exists. The entrance was sealed, but not destroyed. Every clue suddenly aligned. The hidden tunnels, the altered maps, the missing deeds. Someone had needed a secure location beyond official evidence storage, a bank vault beneath the courthouse. Meanwhile, Richard Holloway received a call from one of his oldest associates. They've spoken to Walter. Richard closed his eyes. I was afraid of that. What do you want us to do? Richard remained silent for several moments. Finally, he answered. Nothing. The man sounded confused. Nothing. Richard walked toward the office window overlooking downtown Ashcroft. No more intimidation. No more threats. No more chasing. Why? Because it won't matter anymore. He slowly opened another drawer. Inside rested a yellowed envelope addressed to him by his late father. Richard had never shown it to anyone. He unfolded the single page inside. One sentence stared back at him. If the truth ever surfaces, remember this. You inherited my fortune. You did not inherit my sins. Richard's hands trembled. For 30 years he had convinced himself he was protecting his family's legacy. Now he wondered whether he had simply become its final prisoner. Late that evening, Easton received a phone call from an unfamiliar number. Hello? A voice answered. Dad. Easton froze. He hadn't heard Nathan call him that since childhood. Nathan. I'm outside. Easton hurried downstairs. Across the quiet street stood a man carrying a travel bag, older, broader, gray beginning to appear around his temples, yet unmistakably his son. Neither moved immediately. 32 years of distance cannot disappear in seconds. Nathan finally walked forward. "I don't know what to say." Easton smiled gently. "You don't have to." Nathan looked into his father's eyes for a long moment. "I read Mom's letters." Easton swallowed hard. "You found them?" Emily had mailed scanned copies the previous day. Nathan nodded slowly. "I thought you stopped writing." "I thought you gave up." Easton quietly shook his head. "Never." Nathan's voice cracked. "I believed them. They told me you murdered a man. They told me Mom died because she couldn't accept the truth." Tears finally filled his eyes. "I'm sorry." Easton stepped forward. Without hesitation, he embraced his son. No dramatic speeches, no accusations. Only silence, the kind of silence that heals instead of wounds. When they finally stepped apart, Nathan looked toward the stack of journals inside the room. "What happens now?" Easton answered calmly. "We finish what Thomas Granger started." Emily unfolded the original courthouse blueprint. Her finger rested upon one forgotten location beneath the building. The old bank vault. If Thomas had truly hidden another complete archive, it had waited beneath the heart of Ashcroft for over 3 decades. And somewhere inside that forgotten vault, the final evidence awaited, not only to clear Easton Cunningham forever, but to expose every name that history had allowed to disappear. The following morning, Ashcroft awoke to a town unlike any it had seen in generations. Rumors spread before sunrise. Easton Cunningham had returned with new evidence. Nathan Cunningham, the investigative journalist who had spent years exposing corporate corruption across the Northwest, was working beside his father. Emily Harper had opened county archives that had not been touched in decades. Walter Pierce, the quiet owner of the hardware store who had never publicly spoken about the old case, had finally broken his silence. For the first time in more than 30 years, the story people whispered about in grocery stores and church parking lots no longer belonged to the past. It belonged to today. And everyone understood something was about to happen. Easton gathered everyone inside Emily's archive office. The room had become their unofficial headquarters. Maps covered one wall. Copies of property deeds filled another. Thomas Granger's journals rested beside Owen Mercer's notebooks. Nathan connected his laptop to a portable scanner, organizing every recovered document into encrypted digital files. "If somebody burns the originals now," he said quietly, "they'll only destroy paper. The truth will already exist in hundreds of places." Emily smiled. "Owen would have liked that." Easton nodded. "He planned farther ahead than any of us realized." Nathan looked toward the old courthouse blueprint spread across the table. "The vault?" Emily traced the faded drawing with her finger. "The entrance used to be inside the courthouse basement. It was sealed during renovations in 1993. Walter leaned over the map. "Not completely." Everyone turned toward him. "I worked maintenance for a few weeks during those renovations. The main entrance was filled with concrete. But the emergency ventilation tunnel," he pointed towards the blueprint, "was never closed." Emily's eyes widened. "It exits behind the old records building." Nathan immediately checked recent satellite images. The old records building had long since become an unused storage warehouse owned by the county. No employees, no security guards. Almost forgotten. Exactly the kind of place conspirators preferred. Meanwhile, Richard Holloway stood alone inside his office. His secretary had canceled every meeting. His phone continued ringing. Attorneys, business partners, county officials, state investigators requesting interviews after questions surrounding Thomas Granger's disappearance reached statewide media. Richard answered none of them. Instead, he stared at the old envelope left by his father. He had read it dozens of times overnight. "You inherited my fortune. You did not inherit my sins." Those words had become impossible to ignore. For years, Richard justified every decision by telling himself he was protecting his family's reputation. But reputation built upon stolen lives was not honor. It was debt. A knock interrupted his thoughts. Frank Dobbs entered quietly. "The men are ready." Richard looked up. "For what?" "If you still want the vault cleared." Silence filled the office. Richard slowly folded his father's letter. "No." Frank blinked. "What?" "No more breaking into buildings. No more destroying evidence." Frank stared at him. "They'll ruin us." Richard answered with unexpected calm. "No. My father ruined us. We've simply been pretending otherwise." Frank's face hardened. "So that's it. You're surrendering." Richard walked toward the window overlooking Main Street. "I've spent 30 years protecting dead men. I'm done." Frank studied him for several moments before speaking. "They won't let you walk away." Richard understood exactly who "they" meant. The surviving members of the old network. The people whose names still had not appeared in Thomas Granger's journals. "They may not," he replied quietly, "but I'm not helping them anymore." Frank left without another word. Richard noticed something in his former security director's expression. Not disappointment, decision. That evening, Easton, Nathan, Emily, and Walter drove toward the abandoned county records warehouse. The building stood less than 200 yards behind the courthouse. Its brick walls had darkened with age. Broken windows overlooked overgrown weeds. Most residents barely noticed it anymore. Walter unlocked an old maintenance door. "I kept the key." Nathan looked surprised. "For 30 years." Walter nodded sadly. "I kept telling myself I'd use it someday." The door creaked open. Dust drifted through flashlight beams. Broken shelving lined the walls. Old filing cabinets rusted beneath leaking pipes. According to the blueprint, the ventilation tunnel lay beneath the rear storage room. They searched for nearly 40 minutes. Nothing. Nathan began doubting the map. Maybe the renovations destroyed everything. Walter shook his head. "No." "I remember—" He stopped speaking, then slowly walked toward one cracked concrete pillar. He tapped it twice. A hollow echo answered. Emily smiled. "Behind the wall." Together, they cleared away decades of collapsed plaster. An old steel ventilation grate appeared exactly where Walter remembered. The bolts had rusted completely. Within minutes, they removed it. Cold air drifted upward from darkness below. Nathan aimed his flashlight. A narrow tunnel disappeared beneath the courthouse. Easton looked toward his son. "You don't have to come?" Nathan smiled. "I've already missed 32 years. "I'm not missing today." One by one, they climbed into the tunnel. Unlike the passages beneath Blackwood Ranch, these tunnels felt older. Brick walls replaced concrete. Iron pipes lined the ceiling. Water dripped steadily into shallow puddles. The air smelled of damp stone and history. Nearly 100 feet later, the tunnel ended beneath an enormous circular steel vault door. Its combination lock had long since rusted solid. Emily quietly whispered, "This was the county bank." Walter nodded. "My father deposited money here." Nathan examined the hinges. "They're frozen." Easton ran his hands across the steel surface, then smiled. Nathan noticed immediately. "What?" "I've repaired older things." Using oil pry bars, portable hydraulic jacks, and patience, Easton slowly worked each hinge loose. The process lasted nearly 2 hours. Finally, the massive door shifted, then opened. A wave of stale air escaped from the forgotten vault. Flashlights illuminated rows of shelves stretching into darkness. Boxes, ledgers, metal cabinets. Everything exactly where someone had abandoned it decades earlier. Emily stood speechless. "It's untouched." Nathan immediately began filming. "This changes everything." Easton walked carefully between shelves. Many contained ordinary banking records, others stored county property files. Then he found something unexpected. An entire cabinet labeled Private Trust Documents. The cabinet remained locked. Walter quietly handed him another key. "I found this after Benjamin Ashcroft died. I never knew what it opened." The key turned perfectly. Inside rested dozens of leather-bound ledgers. Every payment, every land purchase, every bribe, every fraudulent transfer, every secret partnership, names, dates, amounts, signatures. Nothing had been destroyed. Everything had been documented. Nathan looked through one ledger. "Oh my God." Emily leaned beside him. "What?" "The payments. Rows upon rows of handwritten entries. County commissioners, judges, surveyors, Sheriff Harold Dixon, Charles Holloway, Benjamin Ashcroft, and dozens of others. Each transaction recorded with meticulous precision. Someone had preserved the conspiracy's accounting records, perhaps believing no one would ever reach the vault. Easton quietly opened another cabinet. Inside rested several reel-to-reel recordings, labeled board meetings. Nathan smiled. "If those still work. We'll have their own voices admitting everything." Emily carefully photographed every shelf before touching another document. Years of archival training guided every movement. Nothing disturbed, nothing contaminated. Everything preserved exactly as discovered. Walter suddenly stopped near the rear wall. There, mounted inside a glass frame, hung an original county charter signed almost a century earlier. Beneath it, someone had engraved the town's founding motto, "Truth builds community." Walter closed his eyes. "We forgot?" "No," Easton answered gently. "They made people forget." Before anyone could continue, footsteps echoed faintly through the tunnel behind them. Nathan immediately switched off his flashlight. Everyone froze. The footsteps approached slowly, not running, walking. One person. Then a familiar voice called into the darkness. "Easton?" "It's Richard." Nathan instinctively stepped in front of his father. "What does he want?" Richard's voice sounded different, not confident, not threatening, tired. "I came alone. I need to show you something." Easton remained silent. Richard continued. "My father lied to me. He told me our family built Ashcroft. He never told me what it cost." Emily whispered, "Don't trust him." Easton understood her concern, but he also remembered Margaret's final words. "Come home without hatred." He stepped toward the tunnel entrance. Richard Holloway stood alone holding a small wooden box. No guards, no weapons. Only exhaustion. He slowly placed the box on the ground. "My father ordered me never to open this. I finally did." Easton looked carefully. "What's inside?" Richard answered quietly. "The confession? That should have been read 32 years ago." Nathan tightened his grip on the flashlight. Emily stared in disbelief. Walter whispered a prayer under his breath. The truth they had spent decades searching for had suddenly become even larger, because if Charles Holloway had truly confessed before his death, then the final chapter of Ashcroft's darkest secret was about to begin. The old bank vault remained silent. No one reached for the wooden box Richard Holloway had placed on the concrete floor. For a long moment, the only sound came from water dripping somewhere deep within the forgotten tunnels beneath Ashcroft. Nathan stood protectively beside his father. Emily watched Richard carefully searching his face for any hint of deception. Walter Pierce lowered his eyes. He had spent more than 3 decades waiting for this moment, yet now that it had arrived, he almost feared the truth more than the lies. Easton Cunningham finally stepped forward. "You came alone?" Richard nodded. "I did." "You expect me to believe that no?" Richard answered honestly. "I expect you to verify everything yourself." Easton looked at the wooden box. What changed? Richard let out a slow breath. When my father died, I inherited his company. I thought I inherited a successful business. I didn't. I inherited 30 years of someone else's crimes. He reached into his coat pocket and slowly removed a folded letter. It took me another 30 years to admit that to myself. Nathan's voice remained cautious. So why now? Richard looked directly at Easton. Because Sheriff Owen Mercer never stopped looking. And because you never became the monster everyone expected prison to create. I finally realized. Nice friend. The only man who still deserved the truth was the man we stole it from. Easton studied him for several seconds before kneeling beside the box. The lid opened with surprising ease. Inside rested several sealed envelopes, a leather journal, one cassette tape, and another handwritten letter. The envelope bore familiar handwriting. Charles Holloway. Easton unfolded the first page. The ink had faded, but every word remained readable. If this letter is ever opened, then everything I built has already begun to collapse. I convinced myself that protecting prosperity justified every decision. It did not. Benjamin Ashcroft taught me that powerful men write history. Thomas Granger proved history eventually writes back. Easton continued reading silently. The confession described everything. Benjamin Ashcroft had created an elaborate system of fraudulent land transfers decades earlier. Charles Holloway expanded it. Sheriff Harold Dixon protected it. Judges approved it. Surveyors concealed it. Bank officials moved the money. When Thomas Granger uncovered the scheme, they planned to destroy every copy of his evidence. Thomas secretly duplicated everything. Before they could recover the documents, he disappeared. Not murdered. Hidden. Charles confessed that Thomas had escaped with help from one unexpected ally. Deputy Owen Mercer. Nathan frowned. He survived. Emily quickly searched through Thomas Granger's journal again. Near the final pages, she discovered a folded document they had overlooked. It was a passport application, issued under another name. Attached was a faded photograph of Thomas with a beard and shorter hair. Emily whispered, "He left the country." Charles's confession confirmed it. Thomas had fled to Canada after realizing every institution in Ashcroft had been compromised. He left behind enough evidence to expose the conspiracy one day, trusting that someone more honest would eventually finish the work. Instead, Easton Cunningham had been chosen as the sacrifice. Richard quietly spoke again. My father wanted one innocent man blamed, so nobody would keep searching. Easton lowered the confession. And you knew? Richard slowly shook his head. I knew my father paid people. I knew he manipulated land deals, but I never knew an innocent man had been framed. I believed you were guilty. Nathan stared at him. And after you learned otherwise? Richard looked away. I was already trapped. The company. The investors. The politicians. If I had admitted the truth, everything would collapse. Easton answered gently. Sometimes it has to. No one spoke for several moments. Finally, Emily broke the silence. We have enough. Nathan nodded. More than enough. The deeds, the ledgers, the recordings, the confession, the photographs, the financial records. This is overwhelming. Easton looked toward Richard. You know what happens now. Richard smiled sadly. I do? I'll testify? Nathan looked genuinely surprised. Against yourself? Richard nodded. I've spent half my life protecting my father's reputation. I'd rather spend whatever years I have left protecting the truth. 3 months later, Ashcroft's courthouse overflowed with reporters from across the country. State investigators reopened every major property transfer connected to Benjamin Ashcroft and Charles Holloway. Federal prosecutors launched one of the largest public corruption investigations in Montana's history. Dozens of fraudulent deeds were overturned. Families who had believed their land was lost forever regained legal ownership. Several retired officials admitted accepting bribes. Others faced criminal charges. Richard Holloway publicly accepted responsibility for concealing evidence after discovering the truth. His testimony helped investigators reconstruct the entire conspiracy. The courtroom remained completely silent when the judge finally addressed Easton Cunningham. "Mr. Cunningham," the elderly judge removed his glasses. "On behalf of this court and the state of Montana, your conviction is vacated. You are hereby declared completely innocent." For a moment, Easton simply stood there. 32 years. Reduced to a single sentence. He had imagined this moment thousands of times while sitting inside a prison cell. He expected triumph. Instead, he felt peace. Nothing more, nothing less. Outside the courthouse, hundreds of people waited. Some applauded, others cried. Several elderly residents approached him one by one. "I should have spoken. I'm sorry. I believed the newspapers. I was afraid." Easton shook every hand, not because apologies erased the past, but because refusing them would only create another future built upon bitterness. Months passed. The legal compensation awarded to Easton became one of the largest wrongful conviction settlements in state history. Many expected him to buy a mansion, travel, disappear forever. Instead, he purchased Blackwood Ranch, exactly as he had promised himself. The abandoned barns were restored. The old farmhouse was rebuilt. The forgotten windmill was repaired and began turning once again beneath Montana's endless skies. But the ranch did not become a private estate. It became the Mercer Cunningham Renewal Center, a place where formerly incarcerated men and women learned skilled trades: mechanics, welding, carpentry, heavy equipment repair. Young adults aging out of foster care found apprenticeships. Military veterans, struggling to rebuild civilian lives, found employment. Families facing homelessness found temporary housing while rebuilding their futures. Above the entrance hung a simple wooden sign: "Second chances are built here." Nathan resigned from his newspaper. Not because he stopped believing in journalism, but because he discovered another calling. He established a non-profit investigative foundation dedicated to reviewing questionable convictions across rural America. Every new investigation honored two names: Thomas Granger, Owen Mercer. Emily Harper became director of the Ashcroft Historical Archive. The first permanent exhibition displayed every recovered document exactly as history deserved to remember it, not hidden, not altered, not rewritten. School children began visiting every year. Instead of hearing only stories about prosperous founders, they also learned how ordinary silence can allow extraordinary injustice. Walter Pierce volunteered twice each week. He often stood before the restored courthouse photograph, the version showing every face. Whenever students asked why he spent so much time there, he answered the same way: "History doesn't become dangerous because people lie. It becomes dangerous because good people convince themselves someone else will tell the truth." Richard Holloway sold nearly every remaining company he owned. Most of the proceeds funded restitution for families harmed by the conspiracy. He accepted legal consequences without appealing. Before entering prison, he visited Blackwood Ranch one final time. Easton met him outside the restored windmill. "I don't expect forgiveness," Richard said quietly. Easton looked toward the turning blades above them. "Forgiveness isn't pretending something never happened." Richard remained silent. "It's choosing not to let it decide who I become." Richard nodded slowly. "I hope I still have time." "So do I." They shook hands, not as friends, but as two aging men who finally understood that truth demanded responsibility from everyone. 5 years later, a bronze memorial stood beside the restored windmill. Its inscription read, in honor of those who lost years to injustice and those who refused to stop searching for the truth. Below the inscription appeared 4 names: Thomas Granger, Sheriff Owen Mercer, Margaret Cunningham, Easton Cunningham. Every autumn the town gathered there, not to celebrate victory, but to remember the cost of silence. On one crisp October afternoon, Easton sat alone on the porch of the rebuilt ranch house watching apprentices repair an old tractor while children laughed nearby. Nathan walked outside carrying 2 cups of coffee. "Thinking about Mom?" Easton smiled. "Every day." Nathan handed him 1 cup. "I think she'd like this place." Easton looked across the ranch. The repaired barns, the restored fences, the turning windmill, the young mechanic patiently teaching another student, the old prison notebooks displayed safely inside the learning center. Then he quietly unfolded Margaret's final letter. Its paper had become soft with age. He reread one familiar sentence: "Come home without hatred." He folded the letter once more and slipped it carefully back into his pocket. The prison had stolen 32 years of his freedom. Corruption had stolen his reputation. Fear had stolen his family. But none of them had succeeded in stealing the one thing that mattered most: the kind of man he chose to remain. As the evening sun settled behind the Montana mountains, the windmill turned steadily above Blackwood Ranch, no longer guarding buried secrets. Now it stood as a promise that truth may arrive late, justice may take decades, hope may seem impossible. But as long as even one honest person refuses to stop searching, no